Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown, so sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. First up on the list for this episode, we have Usagi Yojimbo, the Dragon Bellow Conspiracy. Usagi Yojimbo is an absolutely legendary series, a landmark title that's been a dominant figure in the comic industry since it began, running consistently since its inception nearly 40 years ago. And yet despite that, Usagi doesn't have much recognition beyond its fanbase, a paradoxical existence of invisible fame. I would owe much of this to its lack of establishment beyond the pages of the comic, as outside of an occasional cameo in other works, Usagi is largely contained to his own comic and nothing more. In fact, I'm sure a majority of people who are familiar with Usagi, or have some frame of recognition of him, know him only as that rabbit dude who shows up in the Ninja Turtles from time to time. Which admittedly isn't an inaccurate assessment, but it still misses the greater context. Usagi Yojimbo, translated directly as Rabbit Bodyguard, was created by the amazing, immaculate Stan Sakai, who's written and illustrated the series near entirely by himself since the character's inception. Usagi was originally crafted as a supporting character in Stan's original magnum opus, The Adventures of Nilsen Groundthumper and Hermie, a comedic medieval fantasy story intended to be a massive, sprawling epic, detailing a world of animal people coexisting with and slowly being replaced by humanity. However, as is a fairly common case with these types of stories, Stan found Usagi to be way too cool to just keep waiting around to be a side character, and decided to release stories starring him as the protagonist instead. This proved to be a much smarter decision, as Usagi was, in fact, really goddamn cool, and quickly gained popularity. Usagi made his first official appearance in November of 1984, in issue 2 of Albedo, an independently produced anthology book for artists and creators of the furry fandom. Although Stan himself is not a member of the fandom, or at least doesn't openly identify as one and denies any claim of being a part of it, Usagi would make frequent appearances in other anthology titles until finally being given his own standalone series at Fantagraphics Books in 1987, and has run consistently ever since, changing publishers several times over the years. Set during the closing days of the Sengoku era, the series follows the exploits of the world's most adorable mass murderer, Miyamoto Usagi. Once a high-ranking samurai serving the Mifune clan, Usagi served as a well-respected and feared warrior, until the death of his lord and the destruction of his clan in battle with the book's de facto big bad, the ruthless and maniacal Lord Hikiji. And before you ask, yes, he is a human in a book about cartoon animal people. No, this is never explained. In fact, this is the only time Hikiji has ever appeared on panel in the entire run of the series. Since then, Usagi has lived as a ronin, a masterless samurai, and travels the country of Japan on a never-ending warrior's pilgrimage. Each story typically follows Usagi stopping and getting involved in some form of drama, because Usagi has the crippling inability to stay in his own goddamn lane and keeps inserting himself into everybody else's problems. Usagi generally finds himself changing the tide of events for the better, typically after murdering at least 3 people in the process. Usagi is a series that I've wanted to talk about ever since I started this series, but every time it's crossed my mind, it's always seemed too difficult to do. Usagi is a fairly serialized series, with each issue being a largely standalone adventure that doesn't carry on an overarching narrative. There are ongoing plot lines and story arcs, sure, but they mostly take the backseat in the majority of the issues, with maybe a slight acknowledgement of the ongoing story. Usagi comes and goes on his journey, and other than maybe a line or two, won't mention whatever his current task at hand is beyond the individual story. However, when there is a larger multi-part storyline, they're not exactly beginner-friendly, as they tend to assume you've been following along before that point, as often throwaway moments or seemingly unimportant characters will come back in a major way for said story, and they tend to be reserved to wrap up whatever arc Usagi happens to be currently on. It makes it rather unfriendly for beginners and leads to a difficult time to discuss the story on its own without devoting a majority of my time recapping dozens of issues of stories in the lead up to it. But after putting it into consideration, it may be better to do so anyways, or at least discuss the major elements that are necessary for the story, since that has a higher chance of getting you interested in checking out the series for yourself. Besides, it seems like you people actually like when I go on rambling tirades about comic book lore and history, so why not? So today, we're taking a look at the first major storyline of the Usagi Yojimbo saga, the Dragon Bellow Conspiracy, originally published in issues 13 through 18 of the original Fantagraphics run, and released from November of 1988 to October of 1989. and with relatively good timing I might add, as the story was recently republished as a 6-issue miniseries by IDW from June to November of last year, with restored art taken directly from Stan's original draft sheets and rendered in full color, with new covers by David Peterson. However, we won't be using this version for the review, and that's mostly for reasons I'll get to at the end. The main plot of the story focuses on the eponymous conspiracy, uncovered by chief retainer to the Geishu clan and frontrunner of the Usagi Bowl, Tomoe Ame. Sent to investigate the rival lord, Tamakuro, Tomoe discovers the lord is secretly stockpiling a massive supply of rifles and ammunition, the sheer size of which would make his army nearly invincible in the current state of affairs. Tamakuro's secret now exposed, it becomes a race of life or death for the Geishu clan to get the information to the shogun in time to mount a full offense, before Tamakuro strikes and it becomes too late for the entire nation at large. None of which, naturally, involves Usagi in any such way, as he only ends up involved by sheer coincidence after seeing Tomoe get captured and dragged off. The story arc also wraps up 2 semi-reoccurring plotlines, one centered around Shingen, the leader of the Neko clan and his ongoing rivalry with Usagi. The other focuses on Genosuke Murakami, a bounty hunter and Usagi's on-again, off-again sidekick, who's currently hot on the trail of Zato Ino, a parody of Zatoichi who's been a recurring antagonist so far. Immediately, I want to say that the story is incredibly well paced. Despite the short length of the story, Stan is able to keep it running lightning fast, packing in tons of content in a short time without it feeling rushed. Every page is effectively utilized, whether it be setting the tone of the scene or for an exciting action sequence. Everything flows together well with a natural progression of events, and it rarely feels like it's meandering around or wasting time. The exception to this is the B-plot with Gen and Ino, as while it also keeps the same pacing and narrative flow, it's largely disconnected from the larger narrative for a majority of the story, making it feel rather superfluous to the greater narrative. While Stan is able to tie it in at the end, it's not done that well, coming off rather clumsy and too coincidental. Despite this, the Gen Ino storyline is fun. It serves as a good way to segue between scenes of the main plot without having to rely on jarring jump cuts. I primarily like the dichotomy between Gen and Ino's travels, Gen constantly having worse and worse luck and praying that Ino is as well, only for Ino to be consistently blessed with wonderful luck on his trip, is a good comedic moment that helps lighten the tone without feeling too jarring or contrasting from the main story. One of the things I love the most about Stan's writing with Usagi is whenever the characters have ruminations about their lives and the state of the world, how they feel and how they think in general. Even the most inconsequential character feels fleshed out and realistic for the setting. This doesn't mean that he doesn't have the occasional, unsettled, evil for evil's sake kind of villain, as exemplified here with Tamakuro, whose only real motive is amassing power to overthrow his fellow lords to conquer the country. But this is at least in line with the average feudal lord during this era, so as unsubtle as he is, he's at least a believable villain. His second-in-command, Torame, is much more interesting as a villain, largely serving as a foil for Usagi in this specific story. Both being samurai, they both live and die by the Bushido Code, and this leads to an interesting dynamic between the two as they debate over their own feelings on the samurai lifestyle and the state of the country as a whole. This gives him a level of depth and makes him stand out from Tamakuro, being someone who disagrees with his master's motives but dutifully serves him as is his role. And when he learns that Usagi was merely pretending to be on his side, having joined Tamakuro's army to try and rescue Tomoe, he's genuinely upset and ashamed by the betrayal, having seen Usagi as a kindred spirit and seeing his betrayal as a betrayal of the Bushido Code in general. I think he's a very good villain, and it's a shame that he doesn't make it beyond the end of this arc. While Stan's used similar villains later on, I wish the series had a more recurring antagonist like this, a sort of evil mirror of Usagi. Torame wouldn't quite work as a recurring villain, granted, his arc in this story doesn't exactly allow for it, but with a bit of work it could have been done. The resolution of Shingen's arc is well handled too, kicked off when Tamakuro slaughters a village of his clansmen and, due to a misunderstanding, he believes Usagi to be responsible. So blinded by rage, he can't even be bothered to listen to Usagi. The misunderstandings plot is a little hokey, but at least it fits with Shingen's knowledge of Usagi, and having been humiliated by him in the past, it's understandable he wouldn't want to listen. However, once he learns the truth, not only does he earnestly apologize to Usagi, but the two actually team up to stop the conspiracy. It again plays with the nature of warrior codes and the roles the characters have to fill in society, and I like the odd friendship that begins to develop between Usagi and Shingen in the midst of battle. Unfortunately, status quo requires the Neko clan to be villains, so Shingen ends up sacrificing himself to destroy Tamakuro's fortress, saving the day in the process. It's a short conclusion to his arc, but a good conclusion nonetheless. The action is fantastic as always. Stan always does an excellent job at studying the different fighting styles he represents and depicts them faithfully, showing a shocking level of attention to detail. But of course Stan loves him his cinematic battle set pieces, and Usagi has them as spades. Every battle, no matter how inconsequential, is a massive sprawling showcase pitting our brave hero against insurmountable odds. Yet no matter how one-sided the fights get, it's never a challenge for Usagi and company, slaughtering all who dare oppose him. Not to imply there's no stakes to the action, the risks and threat of the oncoming danger are properly shown and never intentionally made out to be any less than they are. It just so happens that massive, unfair brawls are the environment Usagi thrives best in. The fights are fluid and frantic, Stan preferring to use large, heavily occupied panels to give the reader a sense of intense and kinetic brawling, without having to draw in every step of the way. This also works in the opposite way, as it can simultaneously imply very slow and calculated movement for dramatic effect, without having to change his style to match. The art of Usagi is of course its primary selling point, and this story is no different. While Stan's art is still fairly sloppy and lacks the refinement the later issues have, it's got many of the hallmarks that makes his art so widely adored nowadays. It comes at a weird point in his designs, when Usagi starts straying away from the less cartoony and heavily animalistic look of the earliest issues, but still hasn't quite reached the looser and more stylized look it's better known for. Stan really puts in a lot of effort to make his art stand out in black and white, using relatively thin line work and inking to keep shapes recognizable, and utilizing thick, clustered line work and cross-hatching to its absolute fullest to draw out tons of detail and provide depth and texture. He still seems to have a hard time with character faces, as by this point he's largely begun to ignore the animal nature of characters and gone with more humanoid faces, but hasn't quite adapted to them yet, leading to some particularly awkward expressions and every character having mighty lips when they're talking. But the way characters react and emote to the events around them have a lot of soul to them. They do a brilliant job at conveying the emotions of the cast and the scene, even if they're not the best drawn. This is also why I don't much care for the colorized version of the story. The art simply wasn't made with colors in mind. A lot of Stan's techniques and stylistic quirks look great in black and white, but when done with colored art just look ugly, making the art look worse overall in comparison. Details from the black ink work that should pop out when contrasted with the white instead become muddled, making the art look sloppier than it is and actively lowering the visual fidelity of the scene. While the coloration itself isn't terrible by any definition, it also doesn't try to make itself work with Stan's style, as the palette fails to properly adapt to what Stan intends the lighting of the scene to be, leading to bright colors in what should be dark scenes and relatively slapdash light reflection that seems like it was quickly done with the airbrush tool in Photoshop or what have you. But my major problem with the coloring is that it's just too clean. The colors are all nice and saturated, and it's got a consistent spread all across. And that cleanness doesn't work with the rugged and rough style of Usagi. It almost seems weird to say, I know, but the digital coloring simply does not work with the art style. It needs to have that real feel of hand-painted ink to really work with the art. While I wouldn't say it ruins or hinders the art, I also cannot recommend you read this version over the original black and white. Other than for ease of access with obtaining it should you wish to read this legally, there is absolutely no reason to go with the color version over the black and white. For as major as the story is, it doesn't have much of an impact on the greater narrative of the comic. While Usagi's assistance in stopping Tamakuro's plot lends him the favor of Lord Noriyuki and earning him an honorary place in the Geishu clan, Usagi isn't much affected by the events of this story, carrying on with his journeys same as he always has. But Shingen's sacrifice to save the day leaves the Neko clan leaderless, resulting in his sister and best girl, Chizu, taking his place as chief, kicking off her storyline, which still continues today. Ino would end up getting a happy ending, and aside from a one-off appearance later on in the Fantagraphics run, he'd never show up again afterwards. While it isn't the best of Usagi's bigger storylines, it definitely holds up well, and serves as a great little segment that encapsulates everything that makes Usagi what it is. While its age makes it stand out to a degree from the other, later storylines, it manages to stick out from them well, and Stan does a good job at never deliberately reusing storylines and tries to make every adventure unique. I highly recommend not only the Usagi series in general, but this storyline as well. It's absolutely fantastic and has a little something for everyone to love. I do not recommend starting with it, however, as your enjoyment of the story requires understanding of the characters and their relationships prior to the story. Fortunately, it's early enough in the series where catching up to it is pretty easy, and if you do decide to skip ahead, you aren't missing a significant amount of content. Up next, we'll be taking a look at the first volume of The Demon. Jack Kirby needs no introduction. From his entry to the comic industry in the 30s up until his passing in the 90s, the King near constantly revolutionized the industry with utterly fantastical characters, depicting wondrous worlds filled with bizarre and fascinating concepts and ideologies. No matter the setting or premise, Kirby always put out something fascinating, and even his weaker works had levels of effort put into them that put a majority of modern works to shame. Even when he personally had no interest in a character or a concept, or was stuck working on something he didn't want to, he always put in his all and never phoned in his work. Our current topic is one such example, the first volume of The Demon. Running for 16 issues, released between 1972 and 1974, The Demon tells the tale of DC Comics' famous hellspawn master of prose, Etrigan the Demon. The story behind Etrigan's creation is absolutely fascinating, and really gives a good insight into Kirby's work process and mentality. The story, as detailed by Mark Evanier, is included in the trade collection of Volume 1, and I highly recommend you track it down to read the full story yourself. But the short version goes that in the 1970s, DC editor Carmine Infantino requested Kirby do a series about more supernatural mysteries and monsters, specifically requesting demonic in his description. Kirby, who had limited frame of reference on this genre and personally disliked DC's takes on horror and supernatural, was hesitant to do so, but ultimately gave in, quickly crafting the setting and characters that we see within over a short period to make a story about a literal demon for the company. It's a very interesting little glimpse into Kirby's life and his work, and it does a good job at coloring the view of the story and the characters within. The premise behind The Demon sets us in dreary, dismal Gotham City, home of world-famous superhero Green Lantern Alan Scott, and nobody else worth talking about, and focuses on the exploits of a man named Jason Blood. A demonologist by trade, because you'd have to be with a name like that, Jason has made it his life's work to catalog and research the macabre mysteries of mankind. However, when marauding magical mischief begins to rear its ugly head, Jason soon discovers long-forgotten memories of his past, discovering he is the immortal host of Etrigan, a powerful demon under the thrall of the great wizard Merlin. Forced to awaken Etrigan from his slumber, Jason finds himself drawn to aid in the wizard's battle for the fate of the world, and permanently shifting Jason's role from researcher to guardian of the supernatural, battling against all manner of otherworldly monsters and magics to protect the world from their influences. One thing that's immediately noticeable with the series is just how different it is, both with the overall tone and the presentation of the characters, from the later appearances. This is to be expected as it is with any character, but looking back with how Etrigan was portrayed so soon as even 10 years later on, it's a bit of a shock. For starters, Jason is a far more stoic individual, less brooding and more open to actively engaging in supernatural shenanigans and helping people, rather than having to reluctantly get involved or being forced into it. His relationship with Etrigan is different, with Jason Blood seemingly not being a real person, more a fictitious persona that Merlin crafted to keep Etrigan hidden over the years. It's an interesting angle, Jason himself unaware of his true nature until Merlin awakens him and seemingly subconsciously reinventing himself every few decades to keep the ruse going, and his mind filling in the blanks as his ancestors, is a bit convoluted in its execution, but is a fascinating concept. I personally just prefer Jason be aware of his nature, but Kirby does his best to make it work. It is, admittedly, inconsistent, as some issues treat them as being the same person, and Jason is just a guy Etrigan transforms back and forth from, and some treat them as separate entities, and Etrigan is sealed inside of Jason. What Kirby's intent wasn't exactly clear, and generally speaking, most later writers would simply stick with the latter. Etrigan, as well, isn't as openly evil as he's usually depicted as, although that doesn't mean he's nice by any definition. Willingly serving as Merlin's demon and fighting against the forces of darkness, Etrigan lacks much of the psychotic and morally corrupt nature that he's better known for having, less of a manipulative trickster and more a brutish powerhouse. In fact, Etrigan doesn't have much of a character at all, to be honest, further obscuring the line between him and Jason. This makes him rather uninteresting, as all the elements that make Etrigan so lovable are absent, leading to him coming off more like a rather uninspired Hulk clone instead. Most notably, he lacks his incessant need to speak and rhyme, as he's most famous for. While he'll occasionally throw in a quick rhyme here and there, usually when casting a spell of some kind, it's usually only once an issue instead of how he's more better remembered, for speaking in rhyme every chance he gets to open his mouth. This was, however, originally presented as an in-universe upgrade for Etrigan, and wasn't presented as his definitive status quo from origin until relatively recently, so this is actually consistent with later appearances. It is, however, missed, as while Etrigan has inherently flamboyant theatrical mannerisms to his speech, the rhyming added something unique to the character. The rest of the sidecast is pretty mixed. Rondu, a delegate for the UN, is the best of the core three. Jason's closest friend, possessing mighty psychic abilities and being fairly well versed in the supernatural realm, Rondu serves as a major confidant and, for lack of a better word, sidekick for Jason. I really enjoy him. I like his role as a sort of mediator between Jason and Etrigan, relaying information to them and being one of the only things Etrigan can't overcome, as he's capable of forcing the transformation process both ways. A particularly useful ability as Jason frequently finds himself in overwhelming danger, and Etrigan is rarely willing to go back to sleep on his own accord. Harry, Jason's neighbor and second closest friend, is mostly comedic relief. An ordinary guy thrown into an unordinary world, Harry mostly exists to get beat up or spooked by whatever terrors facing our heroes this issue. He serves as a good foil, both for Jason and for Rondu, acting as a straight man in a sense as he balances out the more abnormal viewpoints of the other two with a more ordinary response to the events that occur. Occasionally he pitches in to help Jason and Rondu fight, but generally he just exists to either get beat up, possessed, or otherwise harmed by the monster of the week. Lastly, there's Glenda, who mostly exists to be Jason's love interest. She rarely contributes anything to the story when she's around, assuming she's even in the issue to begin with, and only ever really acts as a generic damsel in distress when she does get involved in the story. She's a fairly dull character, not having much of a personality to speak of, and as she's on the fringe end of Jason's supernatural shenanigans, she has little to contribute to the plots. Kirby starts setting her up having magical talent near the end, with her coming into the possession of the Philosopher's Stone, which Jason just sort of had lying around his house this whole time, and quickly gains great control over its abilities. But by the time this occurs, there's only like 2 issues left, so it's not explored. Later writers would pick up this leftover tangent, admittedly, but within this volume, that's about the end of it. The series lacks an overarching story or plot line of any sort, each issue being a mostly standalone affair, with Jason and company finding themselves assaulted by a new supernatural threat. Sometimes these stories are standalones, one-offs with Jason inadvertently stumbling into the trail of a terrible entity and doing his best to put an end to it, or at worst just surviving long enough for it to give up. Other issues, however, will continue the story over to the following one, keeping the plot going and further building on it. There isn't any real overarching or continuous villain in the series. The role is somewhat filled by Morgan Le Fay, Mad Sorceress and Merlin's arch-nemesis, but she only appears in the first and last stories of the run and has no influence on the events that occur in between. The sole villain that returns following the end of their story is Clarion the Witch Boy, first appearing in issue 7 to mooch off of Jason and torment him for kicks, before returning in issue 14 to get revenge for his previous battle. I like that little rat bastard Clarion. The very casual and friendly demeanor he has with Jason and company, even as he tries to ruin everyone's day, is particularly entertaining. Kirby puts a boatload of work into building the world of the occult and supernatural for this comic, delving deep into the rules and nature of magic and otherworldly beasts. It all feels very coherent and believable. Never does it feel like any element simply exists for the sake of the plot, and you always get the sense that there's a greater mythology to the elements than we're let on. It lends itself to the setting well, building a realistic occult mythos for the greater DC universe. However, this causes the problem of, the issue it has with the stories is... my major complaint about it is... one gripe I have to say is... you know what? I'm not going to get anywhere in being nice about this. I might as well just rip the band-aid off and say it like a man. It's fucking boring! Look, I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, but there's no better way around it. I find a majority of the stories to be impressively dull. While Kirby does a great job at building the world around them, this leads to a very heavy amount of expository dialogue, slowing down scenes and making them drag on and on. Kirby's very verbose, theatrical prose doesn't really translate well to the horror and occultic genre of the story, as he spends long amounts of time describing the horrific beasts and ghastly frights when his art does a perfectly good job of doing it on its own. This style of writing is inherently bad for this type of story, far from it. In fact, if Kirby wasn't doing this as a comic book, it'd probably be better, but when you include a visual element, it's not exactly needed. A lot of this may come from Kirby's personal dislike of the genre, or general disinterest in writing the book. And while I would never accuse Kirby of phoning it in, I do think it's noticeable when you compare to many of his other personal projects. I would also say Kirby being his own editor here contributed to it, as with greater control over the books, there was less room to be critical of the final result. Kirby's art, however, is excellent as always. Kirby always has a very surreal, dreamlike design sense to his work, and the Demon is no exception. Craggly texturing to emphasize age, lots of broad, thin line work and clusters of simple shapes assembled to create extravagant, otherworldly forms with erratic, bizarre looks. He does have a tiny bit of a same-face problem going on in this one, though. Not enough to be any significant detriment, mind you, but present enough to notice it if you're really focusing on his art. And you should be, considering who this is. There's a great use of shading and heavy black to set the scene, as well as emphasizing textures, and the famous Kirby crackle effect he was known for is used to its fullest, put in places you might not necessarily expect to create a very sublime and unique feeling to a scene, like when it's used to represent smoke from burning flames to accentuate the light and power of the heat, or placed in pools of water to emphasize the scattered reflections of light across the surface. Mike Royer, Kirby's go-to inker during this era of his career, does a fantastic job at enhancing the pencil work and really manages to make Kirby's design sensibilities pop. Although it does feel a bit overly thick in some pages and makes the art look a bit sloppy, but these are comparatively few and far between. The color palette is equally fascinating. Mixing bright saturated tones and duller muted tones simultaneously creates a great contrast, helping highlight the distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Kirby isn't afraid to mix contrasting tones together and manages to make them blend in a way that's surprisingly pleasant to the eye, which lends itself well to his unique art philosophy. The modern restorations for the trade are surprisingly high quality. Much care was taken to keep the tones as close to the original art as possible, and doesn't make it too overly saturated in comparison. There are some touch-ups here and there, mostly for continuity's sake from issue to issue, and these are surprisingly seamless unless you compare directly to a scan of the original printings. While it loses some of the soul without the texturing the printing process provided for old comics, I would say it's a worthwhile way to read it. Overall, while Kirby does a great job at setting up and establishing the characters and setting, he doesn't properly utilize it in a satisfying way. His own personal disinterest in the subject matter largely hinders what could have been a masterpiece. The first volume of The Demon is still good, yes, it introduces great characters and fascinating concepts that would later become some of my personal favorites in DC, but in their infancy they don't really resemble what would later become the characters I so adore. The stories themselves provide interesting concepts, but aren't tackled in a way that effectively puts them to use. And while Kirby's prose is great, it's not a fit for the genre the stories are set in. It's a good example of how just because you created something doesn't mean you're an expert at something. Or, in the immortal words of Henchman 21,
not Kirby's best work.
If you're interested in Etrigan as a character, I would recommend reading it. While it's not the best, elements and story concepts from it would come up at many points over the years, so it's for the best to read it anyways. And that's it for this time for me. Thank you all for continuing to watch, and I appreciate the continued support. We're skipping the typical outro this time as I have something I need to mention. My next video is going to be a bit different than usual, and it'll likely take me a while to finish, so I may not get something out for next month. I'll try to put out a small vid here or there if I'm able to, but otherwise please just be patient as I work on it. I promise you, I don't plan on giving up on making videos again anytime soon.